We are delighted to welcome Rebecca Evanhoe, who is joining us from Brooklyn. So she's going to be up late for us tonight. She is going to be speaking on where conversation design meets content strategy. Rebecca's been a conversation designer for 10 years, designing voice experiences, chatbots, and smart home interactions. Her first work in this field was for Shadow Health, which is a nursing education simulation company. And then since then, she's worked at Mobiquity and Amazon Web Services. And she's currently teaching conversation design at Pratt Institute in New York. And she is the co-author of Conversations with Things, UX Design for Chat and Voice. And if you see down there, kind of in the fine print on this slide here, her publisher, Rosenfeld Media, has graciously allowed us to offer a 20% discount on her book or any of their books if you use the code Seattle20. So do that soon, though, because that expires at the end of March. And everybody should go buy Rebecca's book. But in the meantime, she is here to speak with us. So please welcome Rebecca.
Hi, thanks for having me. I love the coupon code is for any Rosenfeld book. I own a bunch. I'm sure that a lot of folks in the call also are fans of Rosenfeld books. So tonight I'm just going to talk about what content strategy looks like from a conversation design perspective. So Paula already gave a great intro. I'm a conversation designer and strategist, and I also teach, and I wrote this book here. I'm going to go over my background.
Do we have a conflict in sound? Is that just me or anybody else hearing that?
While we're gone, buddy. Yeah. You love hear the back?
Yeah. I hear a TV show or something.
Thank you, sweetie.
I do too.
Okay.
Where's your sister?
She ran out.
Wow.
Maybe we could mute everyone except the speaker. Thank you.
Pretty good. Thanks for halting me. That was important for us to get that squared away.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No worries. All right. So I will talk about my background just because my background kind of also includes the story of like how I became interested in content strategy and information architecture. So I'll start at the beginning. I have a BA in chemistry. Most conversation designers have something pretty weird about their background. And I also studied fiction writing and have an MFA degree in that. While I was in graduate school, I started working at a startup that was designing a conversational product. I was like their 8th person that they hired. This was many years ago. So they brought me on as a writer, but like often happens at startups, I started wearing all these other hats as our understanding of the problem we were trying to solve expanded. So that's really where I cut my teeth on UX writing, UX design and techniques and research, testing, conversation design itself, kind of learning about the tech industry as well. So that 5 years that I spent at that first startup is really how I became a conversation designer. And then from there, I've worked at several different places that Paula mentioned in my intro. And now I work independently, and I also teach at Pratt. So I teach conversation design. And this semester, I'm also teaching UX writing. And I know that at least one of my former students is here, which is really cool. So throughout my journey, I think like a lot of folks who are here, you're either like language lovers or you just kind of have like a content instinct or an information architecture instinct. And I didn't know that these fields existed, but from the very beginning, even at the first startup, I started saying things like, hey, we have this huge database of stuff. We should be like tagging it and organizing it so that it's usable for these different purposes. Calling out in the product that we were building, hey, you're trying to structure it the way that the code is working on the back end. We really should be structuring it how people think about it. Or, you know, people making like wanting to do stuff with certain types of content and me saying like, if you want to use it for that, we have to change it like this, and that makes it less effective, right? So kind of throughout the process, I felt like I needed to advocate for some of these things And after several years, I started learning about like content strategy is a thing, information architecture is a thing. And I felt so excited and also relieved that like I was onto something. And also that I didn't have to make it up anymore, and that there were like processes and articles and people that could help make this work easier. So I'm not an information architect or content strategist, but I have a love of the craft and appreciation for it. And I'm always excited to work with those people. So this talk is kind of in that spirit. So sort of pretend that you and I are working on a team together. I'll be the conversation designer. You'll be a content strategist or something like that. And so this presentation is kind of like, here's what I would want you to know about my world. And I think these are places where our work really like depends on each other. So those are the kind of highlights of what I'll be going through. So I like to start out just saying like what conversation design is. It is a form of a specific kind of user experience design. So it follows the UX design framework, but it is specifically for technology that's talking and listening. The broad umbrella of conversation design includes both out loud, like voice conversations, and also chat typed conversations. And I like to highlight the significance of the word conversation. I define that as the turn-based exchange of language between two parties. And the part that's most significant here is this idea that it's turn-based. Once people start exchanging language or information in turns in like the conversational format, it really changes people's expectations. So I'll highlight how significant that difference is. So let's start by looking at like how a person interacts with a search engine. So this search engine, I'm typing into Google, how much did it rain last night? That phrase in and of itself is conversational. That's something I might say to a person too. The input is language, and the output here is also organized words that I can recognize. So the output's language as well, but this is not a conversation. So as a user, I type in my query, I get these results, I have the understanding that they're like ordered by priority. But from this point on, I know that it's my job to get all the way to answering my question. So I might click a couple things, I'm going to be skimming, I might be moving forward and back, like returning to the search results. And ultimately, I decide when I found the answer to the question. So things change really quickly when you start mimicking the format of a conversation. So this is just like a screenshot of talking to the Lemonade insurance chatbot. It uses language and it is mimicking conversation. It's turn-based. So the bot asks me a question, I answer and return a question. The bot then begins to answer. And what's interesting is even in conversations like this one, where the bot actually returns sort of like essentially search results, these top three, you can see that they're much more concise and in plain language as well. So even when a conversation involves something like search results or menu options, it still changes my expectations. So as soon as I ask this question, I am expecting an answer. So it's just incredibly different from the other ways that we use technology through websites or apps. So the takeaway here is the nature of conversation itself instinctively changes how a person interacts with it and what they expect from it. And it even changes the way they would phrase their query. So even if we have the same question, if we go to a website, we're going to instinctively type it one way. With the chatbot, we might, like that, the scenario being different might change how we type or speak our query. So a lot of companies focus on the question like, how do I get a chatbot or a voice assistant to deliver content? But like I was just explaining, a conversation is you can over focus on just one person in the conversation, but a conversation designer is thinking about this whole exchange and how to get the turn taking to be effective for as many turns as there need to be. So we're trying to let the person speak as naturally as they can without making them feel like there's special rules or keywords. The bot is supposed to be answering on the person's terms. So we're looking at this whole system working together and everything that can kind of unfold along the way. So I'm going to just go through like a quick whirlwind, like there might be more conversational products or types of conversational experiences than you think about. And there's a variation in how we would design for a bunch of different devices and platforms. So there are so many devices that you can use to access some kind of conversation with technology. You can do it on your computer. You can get to chat stuff through websites, but like if you I have a Mac, so I can talk to Siri through my laptop. On your phone, there are a bunch of ways to start talking with, an automated thing. The phone probably has a native voice assistant on it, whether it's the Google Assistant or whether it's Siri, or you can also use apps to get to things like Alexa. You can call and speak to an automated system, and you can even text with a chatbot. And then, of course, there's Internet of Things, stuff around the house, voice-enabled refrigerators, stuff in your car, all that kind of stuff falls into the same, under this umbrella of conversational devices. And then more future-leaning, there's like wearables and hearables and virtual reality. What's notable about kind of the big, most popular visible voice assistants like Alexa, Google Assistant, and Siri is that they, I call those voice assistant ecosystems because you can access the same voice assistant potentially through any one of these devices or a collection of these devices. So I'll go over a couple slides that show like conversation designers aren't just thinking voice versus chat. We're thinking, where does this thing live? So for chatbots, there's actually a lot of variation. You can have the classic, much maligned and deservedly so, when you open up a website and there's that chatbot in the corner that's trying to help you, but often does not. But then you can also make a chat, like have a website that's dedicated to a chatbot, or that's the actual platform. So like Planned Parenthood's chatbot Rue has a dedicated website, and the conversation takes place kind of in the main part of the website. Within the apps that you have, you can often access customer support chatbots, right? So like Bank of America, once you authenticate into the app, you can talk to Erica, that chatbot. Verizon has a chatbot, so that's also common. But you can have a dedicated app that's like explicitly about a chatbot. An example of that is Woebot. So in order to talk to Woebot, you download the Woebot app, and that's kind of the main point of the app. That's the interface where you have the conversation. You can also text with a chatbot. So ResistBot is kind of an easy way to reach your like political representatives. But there, you might have even experienced getting customer support based chats that have some ability for you to text back. And then on the voice side, there's the classic IVR systems, that stands for interactive voice response. So these are probably like the voice products that you've had the most experience with. They're often customer support. The term voice bot is, people use it really, really differently in this field. I use it as kind of like a generic term for any kind of voice interaction, sort of like the counterpart of a chatbot. But these are also often much maligned, but they're definitely prevalent. They're around. And then, of course, we have our voice assistants, which are these large, kind of meant to be for daily life for anyone. They're supposed to help us with a lot of stuff and know a lot of stuff. The big three, Alexa, Google, and Siri, are still the champions. Bixby, Samsung has Bixby and is sort of a distant contender, but is still out there. I think Cortana is going away. And then there's actually a lot of companies working on making custom assistants, often like large corporations who want to have like internal assistants. That's often one of the most common use cases for like a custom built assistant. And like I was saying earlier, as a conversation designer, we don't just think about like talking to Alexa in an abstract way. We think about what the device in that moment of time is allowing you to do. So there's devices with screens, there's devices without screens, there's devices in your ears. There's an app where you can both talk to Alexa and also like mess with your account settings and stuff. So over the course of a day, a user might be interacting with Alexa in multiple channels. So we're thinking about that whole journey. So those are all the products that we think about, and we kind of look at the product and the environment to get a sense of the context of the conversation. So that's one part of the puzzle. We also think a lot about the content itself. Like, what is this conversation about? What are we trying to, what information is the person trying to get? So I'm going to talk about like, when we talk about content and conversation design, this is the stuff that we're working with and thinking about and trying to wrangle. And I'm going to do this by just walking you through an example of a common question that I am asked all the time. So clients will ask me, can we take our website content, some portion of it? Is there anything on our website that we could just take as it is and somehow put it into a voice assistant or make a chatbot out of it? My answer is like a little bit, sort of, but not like you think. And I'll walk through exactly why that is, why I give that response. So let's pretend that we have a website that has news articles on it. It's a classic example. And we have some kind of content repository or like management system where each article has structured pieces. There's a date, there's a headline, there's a summary for each article, and then there's the article itself in paragraphs. So it is possible for us to take this text and put it into a text-to-speech system. So we paste the text in, and then a synthetic voice can read this stuff. Technically, that is possible. When we're trying to turn it into a conversation, you could imagine a conversation where a person could get this news article with their voice, kind of like this. So a person could ask for the latest news on a topic. A chatbot could answer and say, this is the latest one, here's the headline, do you want to hear more about it? And then read the summary to, give the person a taste of the article. And then potentially the person could even hear the full text article after that. So all of that is technically possible. But you can see that my little string here is part of what the bot says, but it's not all of it. There's other stuff that isn't coming from this news article, right? So voice and chat products can use existing content, especially if it is in structured pieces, but any conversational product also has its own content that we need to generate as well. And not all content is going to have that nice structure, right? Like, it's not like we can take any content and turn it into voice. It's like, if the content is in really, really good shape, potentially we can do something with it. And not all content is a fit. And I'm using content kind of broadly, but like, basically clients always want to go, well, I already have all this stuff on the website. Okay, let's just do other stuff with it, put it in other channels. And it's like, it doesn't it doesn't work as magically as that. So what I'm talking about when I'm saying like these products require their own unique kind of new content, some of that is accounting for what the user says, right? So a conversation designer is going to do work curating and accounting for all the variation in what people can say. And that's a form of, like I would consider it a form of content because I have to produce it, store it, and manage it. And then there's also new content in the sense of like, we were pulling over information, but there's this other part of the sentence that has to be written and stored in the system as well. So there's like this connective tissue, like the latest press release on the topic, and then there's the date that's a string that we're pulling in from the repository. So, there's a lot more than just like getting the content read. So again, like to get back to what I was saying earlier, we're always thinking about the turn taking of both conversational parties and making sure that the conversation is successful. So the human side, I'll refer to from here on out as like training data. That's a broad term for it, but for now, we'll just call it that to avoid getting into some unpleasant complexities. And then the stuff the bot says, I would call like prompts, like that's the common term for it. So this content collection, we've got the bot stuff, the prompts. Those prompts need to have a relationship with those little content pieces that we're pulling in, like the date string and the headline string, or like in the question, like, what's the weather? And the bot says, it's 75 degrees. That number 75 has to come from somewhere. I consider it part of the content ecosystem of my conversation design because it's actually like that's the information that we deliver. So it needs to be a part of this content consideration, to my view. And then there's, like I said, there's this training data piece where we have to figure out what a representative sample is of all the different stuff people are going to say, and we're going to have to organize it so that it has a prompt that fits a collection of what we call utterances. So there's other stuff too. Like as a conversation designer, I have to get all this stuff working together. There might be more than just words. There can be sounds, music. We might play audio of a person reading rather than using text to speech. Those are part of the content repository for the interaction that I have to oversee, or any conversation designer would oversee. If there's screens, we might have images, we might have videos, we might have copy on the screen that we also have to write and store in a system somewhere. Some of these like voice assistants or chatbots can send emails or links or text you stuff, right? So we have to design those and store them, and also find a way to tell the team or document, here's when this email gets sent, here's when this text gets sent. I don't have much experience with translation or localization, but that's also something conversation designers would contribute to. There's user data that's stored, like, I might set a nickname for myself in the Alexa app that I want Alexa to call me by, and that string could get pulled in as well. And then especially for like chatbots or anything you're doing with a screen, there are screen elements as well. We might be writing microcopy for the chat interface, for example. Or if you're designing an Alexa skill and it has a screen, there might be buttons or things like that on the screen. So all of this is stuff that has to work in concert and really can't be siloed. So in my very broad view of content, this is all part of the puzzle and requires design, strategy, and operations planning, same as any other type. So I'll go through another example that'll kind of get us into like a different territory. I'm going to start again with a sample of website content. This is just like details about a food recall. So on this website, I'm getting bulleted information, and it's all different kinds of information, and it's easy for me to skim, or hypothetically relatively easy for me to skim. So we can imagine a voice bot interaction that uses some of this stuff. So like a person could ask, are there any seafood salmonella outbreaks? And a voice bot could say something like, yes, there is one. Salmonella reported in seafood distributed by this company. So we can see that like information in here is something that a bot can say. But like the way that it's written on a website, if we're trying to turn that into voice prompts, especially, we would do further editing so that it was easy to kind of ingest with the ear. So and the writing principles are the same, like clarity and concision, that's going to be like touchstones for any kind of writing you're doing, right? But we would make sure it was really, really concise, especially if it was voice, because listening to stuff is high cognitive load. We would want to make sure that the language was, I'm using the term casual, but the language was accessible, essentially. And then we weren't using unusual words that not everybody knows. For something like a list, like you can see in this bubble, I have the list from the website. But that's truthfully an awfully long list to listen to. People really get lost in lists. And so if we're doing it for a voice interaction, we would shorten the list or present it in pieces, or supplement with a screen or something like that. So we really can't rely on lists the way that we do with screened interactions. In general, we have to put information in small pieces. And a lot of times we also do custom tweaking of the way that it's read, or the way the text-to-speech voice like produces it, because while they're pretty good, sometimes to improve the listenability, we add pauses or we change the pronunciation or emphasis of things. So even if we had like really great content to draw from, there's like custom edits that we would want to make if we were making something like really like premium level user experience, which that's often what we want to do. So with this idea of we've got all this content here, and we're going to keep thinking about like, okay, well, what do we have to do to turn this into a voice bot? We have to think a lot about the question and the answer fit. So we know that, and this is true for search as well, but like we know that people ask questions from their headspace. So it's based on what they want to know, and they're using their own words. So they might ask a question that's really, really specific, or they might ask a really broad question. They might use really precise language, or they might use very general language because they don't know what they're asking about. So we go back to this web content. If people have questions like, what grocery stores are affected? Is the fish at Sprouts okay? Or I bought haddock, should I throw it out? If that's the question that I'm coming to the content with, then in this format, I would be able to find my answer because I could skim. These are radically different questions. And if you're writing a prompt for them, these would be very different answers. So this question is about, are grocery stores affected? So the answer should center that. If you purchase seafood in Colorado from these 3 grocery stores, yes, the products may be affected. The question, is the fish at Sprouts okay? That's a yes or no question. It's asking about a specific store. So even if our system wasn't giving a really specific answer, a person would answer that question differently. And a good chatbot or voice bot also would. So these 2 responses have some overlap in the content, but the response is phrased really differently and has kind of a different scope. So this is a huge kind of like, it's like an information architecture and scoping problem. Like, how do we group utterances by their semantic meaning and by, all fitting the same prompt? And this is one of the big challenges in conversation design. So you can kind of see from this example that it's not just that I need to produce these three things, it's that they're all independent. So how I sort my training data is always going to impact how I write my prompts. And a lot of times those decisions are constrained by limits of the technology. Okay, so now I'm just going to go over some stuff that people who really like language or people who are really interested in like information architecture, things like that, just find really interesting. So this is just like a little jaunt through some topics that are probably of interest. So we think about tone a lot. Hang on one second. Sorry, I've got some background noise. Sorry about that. So the tone here is something we think about, and anybody who does writing, especially for a brand, thinks about the same things. But it is really, really impactful in conversation. So we do use tone to think about how we might write a prompt, like what the bot says. And just some examples here of how we would tweak our writing based on what we're trying to capture. So this is a huge thing that we study, we research, we do experiments with, we test to make sure that the bot's tone is right for the situation and that we're conveying it properly. But it's hugely important because of this thing called accommodation. So this is like a linguistic phenomenon that, like, when two people are talking, they adjust how they talk, like the manner in which they speak, as well as the words they choose and how they say them, and other stuff like gestures. They adjust it based on their conversational partner. And research shows that people do this with bots, even though they consciously know that they're not talking to a person. It's like an instinct that we can't turn off. So we do accommodate when we're talking to devices. So that means that how we write is not just like, what are we getting across? Does it sound good? Is it meeting our brand goals and things like that? It's like what the bot says is going to impact literally the utterances of the users. So if the bot seems, really open, really casual, really informal, let's say the bot seems kind of chatty, a person might reflect that. But what can happen is if the bot sort of misrepresents what it can do, then people can start talking in a way that the algorithmic system can't actually handle very well. So it's such a huge consideration, like the tone and personality that we're working on. And again, everything's interconnected. So here's another example, and I'll just be quiet for like 5 seconds and let people kind of skim this. So here, these aren't radically different in tone, but I don't know, you call it like their structure or their function or the position of the question is different for each of these bots. And you can see that it would change the way that people would respond. So what can I help with? It's pretty open-ended. Ask me a question is kind of inviting people to phrase it as a question. And, people can say whatever they want. There'd be a lot of variations. So not everybody would phrase it as a question, but more people would. And that would impact how we curated the training data so the algorithmic system could recognize what people are saying. So we're thinking about the tone, we're thinking about personality, and we also think about kind of like functional or structural things. And not last, but we also think about the tone of the voice itself. So we want to make sure that the tone of the writing and what the voice sounds like fits the situation. So here's just like a little bit that I'll play to give 2 samples. I'll start with this one.
Good morning. Your investments are up 1.5%, which is a substantial increase from last night's closing bell.
So you can hear that's using like financial jargon. It's a very crisp professional voice versus this synthetic voice.
Good morning. Your investments are up 1.5%, which is a substantial increase from last night's closing bell.
So that was a child's voice, which is a little bit jarring for this financial situation. And that, you know, depending on the product and the brand, that might be a choice you made, but that's something that we think about a lot, like how the voice that people are hearing, that's like a huge decision and a huge factor in how people respond to a bot. So I'll just summarize some of the challenges that I've talked about. At the core of the whole thing, like the whole reason that conversation design is hard and the reason why content design is hard is because language has almost infinite variation. Like the ways that you can phrase the same idea is nearly infinite. And then we also know that like within a language, we're talking about many dialects, many accents. People might use specific sets of vocabulary based on their job or their region. Changes in 2 sentences could be like almost identical except for one little change and have radically different meanings or even opposite meanings. People are really good at interpreting that subtlety, but bots aren't. So that's always something that we're struggling with. And then languages change over time. So any voice or chat product is really never done. There's new words, new queries that come in. Like, you know, 2019, I don't think Alexa would have had an answer for questions about COVID. And then on a certain day in 2020, everybody was asking Alexa about COVID. So we're never done kind of optimizing and adding and growing these things. There's issues with cognitive load, which like anybody who works with language and products thinks about this, right? We want to make sure the language is accessible so that we're not increasing the cognitive load. With, like I mentioned, with text-to-speech voices, those are inherently higher cognitive load, like they just don't quite sound right. So that like adds an extra layer of difficulty in us parsing what we're hearing. There's a huge need to break information down into like really small pieces. And then, like I mentioned earlier, sometimes we have to like tweak and kind of change just so that a sentence, even if well written, might need tweaks to be easier to listen to. And then, of course, there's like the classic content stuff. A lot of the conversation design content is contextual. So a prompt on this device might be different from the prompt on this device, or the prompt in the morning might be different than the prompt at night. There's a million things you would change depending on context. Like I mentioned, voice content needs special attention. This is not specific to conversation design, but like with copy and prompts and all these things, there's always a ton of stakeholders and it's very, very iterative. So getting the stakeholders informed, getting feedback from everybody is always, you know, this is just like a tech industry challenge. And in an early stage, or if you're making a really big bot, you know, I talked a lot about how the prompts and the training data are interconnected. And as we're building and testing, we're re-architecting those things pretty drastically throughout the process. So that really makes a strong need for really good content processes. Otherwise, design and writers and developers all make each other bananas. So that iterative, the highly iterative nature really means that like putting content processes and repositories into place is essential. And as I've been saying, all these parts are interconnected. So you might want to make one little change over here, but it has a ripple effect out to these other parts. So conversation designers both have to understand nitty-gritty details of all the pieces, but also the zoomed out view of how they fit together. And I'll kind of close. I've talked a lot about like more like content design stuff, but obviously the strategy part is essential, and I would be interested in hearing from folks on this call who are content strategists where you see it plugging in. But I get asked by clients all the time, what's the best way to design a chatbot? Which is better, voice or chat? Tell us best practices for writing prompts. And I can't answer any of these questions until I understand the strategic goals of the product that we're trying to build. So I can't tell you which is better, voice or chat, until I understand what we're building. I can't tell you best practices for writing prompts until I know the scenario. So a lot of the work that I do with clients is this classic strategy stuff, like, or it has intersections with design thinking too. Like, who is this for? What are our customers like? What are they doing? And what are we trying to do with that process? How are they solving it today? Where, like, what need are we trying to serve? And what technology do they have? If we find out that our customers don't have Alexa devices, then we shouldn't be building something for the Alexa platform, like those kinds of things. We always think about the purpose of course, the business goals. We want to define success. Like, if we're trying to solve a specific problem with this product, how do we know that we are solving the problem? A lot of companies are in like a test and learn phase right now, where they just want to make like a little chatbot or a little something, which is great. I think those being in a test and learn phase is really important. But also we have to be strategic about like, okay, we're building a chatbot, but like, what are we trying to learn? And who needs to learn stuff? Who needs to be involved with this? And once we learn stuff, then what do we do? So walking companies through that is something that, these are all important conversations. And then there's also this idea of fit. Like, okay, we know the audience, we know the purpose. So what do we like? What technology and what content plugs into that? Like, what form of technology supports the goals? All of these questions are really important. And a lot of times clients ask me this stuff and they want kind of like the blog version, like 5 things to do for writing prompts. But a lot of the education that I do as a consultant is, let's start in the proper way and actually assess all of these things before we dive in. And I mean, I could talk a lot about the sorry state of content operations and for a lot of companies that make conversational products, but it's really essential. Like, there's so much to keep track of. It's not just like the content, all the stuff that you need to make an Alexa skill or a chatbot. We also need to understand the relationship of that content to the whole content ecosystem that the company already has. Where do these things live? How does the technology grab it? Who edits it? What are the content processes? Who approves it? All that kind of stuff. So all that to say, I think the field of conversation design, in my experience, a lot of companies have not started to realize, oh, we hired content strategists because we know what they can do for the web, and we know what they can do for our app, or we know what we can do for campaigns that we're running, but they haven't connected that into conversation design. And I think that it's really, really, really essential. So I think there's so much room for our fields to like connect and grow and advocate for each other within an organization. So if anything that I've said is resonating with stuff you're thinking or conversations happening at your company, feel free to reach out. I do lots of work with companies and a lot of advocating for getting things right from content strategy perspectives. And here's that promo code again if you're interested in the book. I will say our book doesn't talk about content strategy explicitly, but I do think it is really useful for anybody on any team that's working on a conversational product. And you can find me on Twitter. That's kind of the best place. So yeah, that's what I've got for you. And I'm really, really looking forward to your questions. I'll get
Thanks,
caught
Rebecca.
up in the chat. Yeah.
Yeah, we definitely have a few questions.
Awesome.
So I've got some queued up here. I'll just go through them, and what I'll do is I'll go through them in order. First one is from Mark, and let me, I'm just going to scroll back up and read the question exactly. So Mark asks, are there character limits for each chunk of content, or length limitations on what you can do?
This is I joke with my students that I should make a hat that says it depends on it, because that's what I say all the time. So there are, I mean, character limit feels very especially if it's voice, a very long word could have very short pronunciation. So character limit isn't always the right metric. And it also depends on like not just character limits, but like the nature of the words that you're using. If they're really long words, if you have to use a piece of jargon, making sure the rest of the sentence doesn't have jargon. So character limit is a factor, but we would also be looking at, like, when we make those chunks of content, we're thinking about like, how many ideas is it expressing? What words do we need to use? And then how do we cut out any extraneous words? So, I love to complicate things. So I would say I wouldn't prescribe a character limit, but there would potentially be other metrics that we could draw.
Okay, thanks. And apologies if I don't pronounce your name correctly, but I believe it's Kanishka asks, how to build content for a fairly dynamic website like e-commerce, which largely depends on user requirements.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's a hard problem. It's hard if you're just doing it in a website, but for really dynamic content, I'm trying to think here. So for something like that to be scalable, you would be looking for ways to take the same structures and patterns that you're using on the website into voice interaction. So like you would want to create as much directly reusable content as possible. And that might limit the kinds of voice interactions that you build. I feel like I'm being really abstract because that's just like a tough question, but I'm also kind of curious in this question, the depend on user requirements part. I wonder if Kanishka could.
Yeah, if you want to unmute Kanishka and elaborate on that, feel free. Yeah. Well, maybe they're not.
So I just meant if the user's requirements are completely different for one item, and when it comes to the next item, they can be pretty vague about their requirements. As in 5 things at the same time the user can be looking at and coming to the chatbot in this area. And then if they do ask their question, how would the bot decide to prioritize whether to go for the first item or the second item, or how would it answer?
I see. Yep. So conversation designers build in like a lot of logic, and the logic depends on like a lot of different things. So for example, a question might be answered different for a user who's authenticated versus a user who's not authenticated. Or sometimes we would have conditions based on, like, if I'm talking to a voice bot and it's a banking voice bot, and I say I want to pay my credit card bill, I would get different responses depending on if it was overdue, if I had 1 credit card, if I had 5 credit cards. So we basically plan all that logic out and then collaborate with developers to see what's possible. Because like all of our prompts are super contextual and depending on like all of these different factors. So basically like conversation designers make a plan for what would be best for the user, and then developers would work with us to tell us like how much complexity could be supported.
Nice. Thanks. And Paula had a question about, she's interested in hearing how the language in these conversational constructions is tested. So how would you test the language you're using?
Yeah, the language in terms of the bots, like what the bot says.
Oh, and Paula, go ahead. And, yeah.
There was another question later that's kind of similar. I think it was Ariel's question about sort of how do you brainstorm the possible user inputs. I think it's kind of the flip side of that is sort of how do you decide, all of the ways that you could answer a particular question, and then how do you assess which ones are the most successful or whatever. Do you are there kind of logs you can output and kind of analyze how the conversation went and see where it went wrong? Or do you actually try them out on users in a kind of more of like a regular user testing sort of scenario or what?
Yeah, gotcha. So we do tons of different types of testing and validating. So if you're talking about like on the human side, how do we figure out all the different stuff people are going to say? A lot of times, if you have something like chat logs or conversations that you can listen to between a person, like two people having the same conversation, you can use that as a basis. If you are imagining, if your product is like a conversation that doesn't really take place, like talking, between like a person, if you're making like an Abraham Lincoln chatbot, there's just like nothing there's no chat logs for that. So a conversation designer would make their best guess, and then you, through usability testing, would identify additional questions, additional sources of variation. So that's kind of like the super simple version of the people side. And we also test the bots prompts quite a bit. So, we do like A/B testing with bot prompts to see which ones are more successful. We do like personality assessments where like we have people interact with the bot and then ask them to describe its personality, or say on a scale of 1 to 10, how confident do you think it is, and those sorts of things. So we have to do all this stuff to make sure that everything is like working. Every single element is doing its job. But yeah, there's like tons of testing methods. And we also do a weird one called Wizard of Oz testing, where it's like a form of usability testing where a person pretends to be the bot and the tester doesn't necessarily know that that there's like a person behind the chatbot. And so we can even test like products that don't exist yet. Yeah, there's like lots and lots of techniques for making sure the whole system is working together and all the individual pieces are working.
I gotta say, I love the Wizard of Oz test. But
Yeah,
I think the next question.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. The next question is from Katie, and I think you just answered a lot of it, but let me read it just to make sure there might still be a part that you can respond to. She says, so when you're first starting out, how do you account for all the different ways a person might say something to make sure that the bot responds correctly?
Yeah, I mean, to piggyback on what I was saying, it's like we kind of come up with an initial version that we know is not like, doesn't have the coverage, doesn't have the accuracy, isn't actually the final version. Like we know that our first version is inherently crappy. And then we have people talk to it. And like Paula was saying, like we look at the transcripts and we can also get logs of like stuff that didn't match. And we also do a lot of regression testing, because it could be the case that you like add a bunch of question types and questions to your training data. And then for some reason, the bot starts performing worse. So basically it's like we come up with our best guess, and then over and over and over, and even after launch, we're continually like assessing it to account for, to discover stuff we didn't predict yet and stuff that the bot can't handle yet.
Well, thanks. And Angelica had a question. What's the best practice for linking web content, such as a knowledge base articles, in a chatbot? Should the bot summarize the content before providing the link with more detailed information?
So for this one, I always take a step back and go like, why are you building a chatbot that's just giving people web links? It might be a value add, but like I always question that. And a lot of clients go, well, our website is like underperforming. And I'm like, then I think you need to fix your website, which, like I had a client who had this epiphany that was just like perfect. And they were like, oh, a chatbot is only as good as the content in it. And I was like, yes, that's exactly it. So like, all that to say, generally, it's not best practice to make a chatbot that's actually a search engine. Like a chatbot, a search engine masquerading as a chatbot is setting user expectations really high and under delivering. So, I mean, I worked on tons of chatbots where it did indeed deliver web links. And typically, it's like the classic confidence stuff. Like if it's really high confidence, we can give them one link. And then if they say, no, that's not what I wanted, then we give them the next three options. I mean, it's as simple as that. But I also think from a strategic perspective, I always start asking the questions of like, why aren't we taking the time to like actually just give an actual answer to the question instead of just giving them a link that they probably have already looked at? I think that those kinds of loops where like you try a website search function and then you're like, I can't find it. I guess I'll go try the chatbot. And then you try the chatbot and it gives you a link that you already looked at, which just like makes people crazy. So yeah. It happens. We do that sometimes, but the bar, we can set the bar higher for that or try to iterate towards a better system than just web links.
Nice. Yeah. Well, and then Ariel has a question, and it's kind of related to early, but it's more around like kind of procedurally, like how do you inventory, catalog, brainstorm all of the possible user inputs for a conversation?
Yeah, I think that's the question about like, how do you figure out all the stuff people are going to say? And it's a hard thing to do. We know we can't predict everything. So it's like that, we make a first draft and then we test and iterate.
Yeah.
Got it.
And Sierra had a question. Or Ariel, did you want to elaborate on that? Or
No, that was perfect, actually. It's nice to know that you kind of don't throw the perfect thing out there. You just put out what you can and then test it and let the feedback kind of iterate the product.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the testing is essential and people often underestimate it. But like we're really trying to get like thousands of transcripts. So like the testing part is a really big deal.
Then Sierra asks, regarding accommodation, curious if there's any research about how people's attitudes change when they talk to a bot, like being rude or cursing or being polite, like how do people interact with bots? Yeah.
There are different mental models that people bring. So there's, like Nielsen Norman Group has a good summary article about this. And then there's also a book called Wired for Speech, which is like it's from 2010. So it's not the most recent, but it's like the research roundup of like how people interact with bots and what they think. But basically some people start out just being like, this is technology, and they type in short telescopic phrases. They don't try to talk to it like a person. They don't expect it to be like a person. So they just are like, this is technology. Then there are other people who try, who like do approach it with like a conversational spirit, and they are trying to talk the way they would with a person, those usually fail and cause the person to like start adjusting their behavior. And then in terms of like people swearing at bots, and people do curse at bots. They do write in all caps. They do, I mean, like write, I would call it like write, not quite in third person, but they'll be like, hey, whoever's behind this chat bot, you should know it sucks. And then especially if it's a voice interaction and if it's female presenting, people also like sexually harass it or say stuff to like try like hey, you're hot, like stuff like that. And that's a pretty G-rated version of some of the stuff that can happen. But yeah, people also like kind of poke at the corners to see like how far does this thing go, how smart is it. So there's kind of like the raptor at the fence mental model. Yeah, lots of different approaches, but you do see kind of like a big range of people. You know, you can tell like some people think they're dumb and some people think they're smart, and kind of approach it from those two different perspectives.
Nice. And then Ariel had another question that I'm really curious about as well. What kinds of content management systems supports conversation design? Are they generally custom built, or?
This is a sad question. I mean, it's like the question, but a lot of the conversation design tools are really underserving the content management problem. So like a lot of the products that I like for design don't really have any versioning or content management support, which is totally bonkers. I worked at the startup that I worked at, we had a custom tool that managed all of the conversational content. So, I mean, that really influences how I think it should be. But yeah, I hope that they get better. I'm working with a company who has an existing repository, and we're exploring ways to like use, what are some of the most common ones? Like Jargon, Gatherly, those are a couple. They're not really set up to support conversation design products, but I think there are potentially ways to shoestring some stuff together. And a lot of conversation designers use spreadsheets. So not an elegant place today, but I really advocate for the importance of it, because like, as you all know, like if it's like you can organize the content all day, but if it's not in a place where it can, you know, move through the chain of operations and get to the users, then like there's no point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and actually, and Danielle had piled on that question and wanted to know about those content repositories too. I'm curious if you've seen any of the headless CMSs like Kentico or Contentful or Sanity or any of those doing stuff with voice.
I haven't, but I think I'm ignorant. I haven't really looked into those specific ones.
Okay, cool. And then Bill had a question, again, related to Ariel's question. How are documentation and guidelines structured and delivered in relation to brand and product in particular, he's asking?
Yeah, so usually in terms of like where like the personality of a bot and the language that we're using has a relationship with a branding or marketing arm, a lot of times we make like a style guide and document some specific like elements of the personality that we're trying to capture. So I mean, you know, that usually lives in like a wiki, and we'll kind of create lists of like what audience and purpose and what are the character traits that we're trying to accomplish and what are the style conventions that are going to support that communication. So yeah, mostly we do it like a wiki with these elements documented and approved by a bunch of different stakeholders.
Cool. And I love this question from Christy. Do people really like chatbots having a personality? Does it generally create confidence in the company or product? And she says it does the opposite for her. That doesn't inspire that.
Totally. I mean, so many chatbots are trying too hard. And like there's And I think what is happening actually is just like, it's really cool to get to design a personality for something. And I think people get excited about it, and they come up with these complicated backstories that aren't, I agree that they aren't really necessary. Give me 1 second. I'm going to try and find this tweet. And I know I can find it quickly, but it's basically the tweet that sums up. Here we go. Okay. I'll share my screen again. So I'll be quiet and let people skim this tweet. So there's research that shows that like people always perceive a personality. So there's a quote that this designer Wally Brill says is like, if you don't design the persona, the user's imagination will do it for you. So we can't opt out of personality design, but sometimes the personality that we're designing is straightforward, uncomplicated, humble, doesn't refer to itself. Like, so sometimes the personality, we always plan it, but sometimes the personality is like, it needs to be chill. It needs to be in the background.
Got it. And Kanishka had another question. In your experience, what use cases should conversational design try to solve? Are there cases that are more suited to conversation than other kinds of interaction?
Yeah, I mean, I think Google has a really good checklist. It's simple, kind of oversimplifies things, but it's a useful starting point where it's like, what's a good fit for conversation? And one of the criteria is like, are people already talking about this? Like, are people already having conversations about this? Some other metrics are, does conversation make this faster or less complicated in some way? I bet I can find the Google article too. But yeah, here it is. So, I mean, we see chatbots most often in like customer support. That feels very unimaginative to me. I think the more interesting things are happening in like gaming, healthcare, education. Like there's some really interesting stuff happening in those spaces. Like the startup that I worked for was making a product that trained nurses how to give patient interviews. So it was giving them the chance to practice conversation in like a no risk environment. And I think those sorts of use cases are always interesting to me. Like, how can something help you be a better person, like, or be a better communicator to other people? I think those are kind of my favorite. But really any vertical you see trying to do chat and voice stuff right now.
Got it. Hey, I want to go back. Christy, I noticed you had your hand up. Did you want to elaborate on your question, or did we get to everything?
Most of everything. Thank you very much. I guess I wanted to expand, like a lot of times I see chatbots that have names and that have little sort of avatars. And I think I was thinking more of like that sort of personality rather than, sort of like they've really made this into a human being rather than just something that gives you information.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you and I agree on this, so I'm pretty opinionated about it. In our book, we have a framework that sort of gets people to question, like, it doesn't need a name. It doesn't need a gender. There are techniques you can use to like, it's still conversational. So it's still doing something that only people do, which is like talk and use language. But yeah, it doesn't need to have a human-like avatar. It doesn't need, let me share my slides again. I make fun of this a lot, but let me find the Amtrak slide. So Amtrak's chatbot is named Julia, and this is the avatar for it. And like literally there's no reason you're calling to change a train ticket or book a train ticket or find the status of a train. There's literally no reason why Julie needs to have a name, why she needs to be a person. It could be like, I'm Tracky. You know, it could be a non-person. It could be a logo, like Bank of America's Erica doesn't have an avatar, it just has a logo. I most often encourage clients to start assuming that you don't need these really highly personified elements. And if you do want to add them, have really, really, really good reasons why. And you have to understand that it changes user expectations as soon as you start introducing names and images. So,
Yeah,
and you'll notice that like even Alexa and Google Assistant don't have human avatars. They just have sort of like symbols.
Yeah, thank you. Yes. Thank you for, I guess, being on the same page as me, because I get freaked out. I'm like, no, this is not a human. This is a chat box. And also I feel alien. I mean, I look like a lot of those avatars, but it could alienate and really push away a lot of people if they don't feel themselves being seen by that avatar or having a name that's very, very English.
Yep, absolutely. Somebody in the chat references Clippy too.
I have a friend who worked on Clippy, and I send her a note every time he comes up. So, Teresa asks, do you have data that shows what percentage of users go to the chatbot as their first line of defense for help versus browsing, using navigation, on-page, on-site search, or other methods?
I don't have data on that, but looking at how advice that I give companies is always like, you need to look, a chatbot is an additional channel in this system of all the other channels. And so I don't have data because I think a lot of companies are not caring about that, but I think it's super essential to understand, like, you would design it totally differently if people are coming after searching the web and then trying a chatbot or a voice bot versus if that is the first line. So it's a huge question that companies should be doing research to find out, because they would really impact your design decisions. That's the way
my brain's breaking a little bit trying to figure out how you could gather that data and still protect privacy. And anyhow, it's yeah. Emily had a question, and Emily, if you want to elaborate on this, feel free to unmute. But she has go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, and privacy is a big issue with me. Hi, Rebecca. Good to see you again. I work in healthcare and clinical research, and I was a high-tech geek at Intel and Siemens, so I'm dangerous in both worlds. But I always felt that healthcare is the hardest thing to do. And Rebecca mentioned the interaction with nurses. So working at Stanford and Dana-Farber and all these other cancer centers, we're now decentralizing, and there's just not enough nurses and doctors and clinicians. So we're creating these augmented workforces so that we do screening. Now, my company actually does this stuff, and the Japanese government takes it and starts spinning our chatbot to do actual screening. The seniors have to go through the chatbot identification process before they can go to the doctor or get into the medical center. And this is because of COVID and the Olympics and all that stuff going on, So what I've created, and I'm trying to get people to road test it with me, is actually where the user or the caregiver can do kind of a profile. Like you do your preferences. I'm interested in these topics. Here's my age range. We don't want to isolate them, but it's different if you're assuming you're talking to the patient or you're talking to the caregiver. So you need to know which one. Oftentimes the family will share a phone number. The kids are listed. There might be 4 or 5 kids, or in Latino communities, there could be 10 people sharing one phone, and you don't know which Maria is calling, and checking. So I'm trying to create some intelligence, but I just, as a off the cuff, how do you folks feel if I were to interview you as a chatbot, say, please answer or verify that this is Maria Gonzalez, the mother and not the daughter, things like that, because I want to make sure that I'm addressing your questions correctly. And it is a privacy issue. So I also work with the CCPA here in California to look at the regulatory issues. But in terms of designing and strategy, I'm open to suggestions because this is a big pill to swallow and I'm trying to wrestle with it. So thank you. I appreciate your time.
Yeah, I mean, all of these, it's like, I think our industry is in a place right now of like asking really good questions and calling out challenges and tensions without super clear solutions. So, I mean, I think for the question of like, can we use a chatbot to kind of set up accounts or onboard people or get initial data from them? The answer is like, yes, I think often that can be a really good use case. But my question is always like, how are they doing it today? And like what's wrong with that? Like, does this need to be a chatbot or can it be a form? Can it remain a form? Like, what's the value add of it being conversational? Because it won't necessarily be shorter. If it's conversation, it might actually be a lot longer than filling out a form. But some people might prefer the conversational format. One, they might be using a screen reader and the form is crappy for them. Two, they might prefer it. Three, they might want to be walked through the options. So that, I mean, it's all about the strategy behind it. I mean, I understand, Emily, the problem you're describing is like, there aren't enough people to do some of these tasks. But yeah, I mean, I definitely think the ultimate North Star is to have more than one way for people to do things and help them be supported in whatever channel they choose. And then particulars in your question, Emily, of like in a multi-person household, you know, how do we provide really custom experiences without, like, to do that, we need lots of data. So, you know, it's sort of this question our industry is chewing on, like, how do we provide these super custom experiences that require data to do so without overstepping any privacy boundaries? And I mean, I don't have a great answer, but I do think, again, that's a hard problem. And Emily always asks really good questions, really hard questions from her experience.
We're coming up on the half hour. I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next question. Maybe one or two more questions, what we'll try to get in. Human asks, when customizing content, when converting it into conversation and considering the bot's personality, how significant is the copywriting and UX writing in that?
Mm-hmm. It's pretty significant. You know, I like to say we usually rewrite prompts like a dozen times. With my current client, we're working on a prototype project and it's me. I mean, I'm doing a lot of things, but one of them is the writing piece, and I'm writing and also consulting with another UX writer who's, you know, two heads are better than one. So it's significant, and it is not, it's also not done. Like, people often are like, okay, we'll write the prompts and then we'll put them in. And that's like, I can draft the prompts, but then we have to test them. And then we have to, you know, improve them because context matters and all these things. So yeah, it's a lot. I mean, some companies hire those as separate roles, the conversation designer and the conversational copywriter. Depending on the scope of the product, I think sometimes that's necessary just from volume alone. But even if the role is split out among two people, both people have to understand the context, like where in the conversational flow the prompts surface, because that's the only way to kind of like write them correctly. But yeah, it's a big job, very iterative.
Cool. Well, good. Paula, did you have anything last? Or I know we're coming up on the half hour and we've been pretty good about ending on time. And I know it's late for you, Rebecca. We don't want to keep you up too long.
Sure, thanks to Rebecca. It's 10:30, almost her time. I don't have any other questions other than to say I think we could probably keep this conversation going for hours.
No kidding.
Thank you, everybody, for all your great questions, and Rebecca for such an interesting presentation. And I'll just say again, join us. As I said up front, we do these every month. And we'd love to see you back. We've got a Slack channel we'd like to see you at if you're interested in joining us there. We do, post a lot of our event information and stuff there, so consider joining that. And other than that, hope to just see you all again at another meetup. And thanks again to Rebecca.
Thanks, this was really fun. Great questions, everybody.
Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks, everyone.